Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Bastani. Coming up tonight, Keir Starmer limps on following the explosive Peter Mandelson scandal. For now, Wes Streeting begins clearing the path towards the leader of the Labour Party. But does he have a hope? We have an extraordinary interview with Richard Sanders, one of the first journalists to cover the Jeffrey Epstein and Prince Andrew scandals in the UK. And speaking of Andrew, his biographer has suggested that a former British Prime Minister once had a threesome with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. I'm Aaron Bastani, and tonight I'm joined by Kieran and Andrieu. Kieran, how are you?
It's a wild world. The political seas are very choppy, but being here with you, Aaron, every Tuesday at 6 p.m. is a port in a storm. So I'm doing well. How are you?
This is the rock of stability.
It is. It is.
In our personal and political lives.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, so I always say that to my wife. I say, I'll always have Tuesday evening with Kieran and Andrieu. No matter what you say to me. No, she's always very kind to me, of course. We are looking forward to a really great show tonight, of course, focusing particularly on the ongoing Epstein stories. I mean, I just have to say, the whole team here at Novara Live have been extraordinary in the last week. The numbers have been huge because this is a huge story. They don't come along every day of the week. Keir Starmer has survived as Prime Minister for now. It's been a tumultuous few days for the PM. Over the weekend, his Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, quit, leaving Starmer rudderless. A day later, and Downing Street's communications head, Tim Allen, who had previously worked for Blair a few decades ago, also quit too. At the same time, Scotland's Labour leader, Anna Sawar, publicly called for Starmer to step down. As a result, Starmer has found himself deeply isolated after it emerged last week that he appointed Peter Mandelson to the role of US ambassador despite knowing about the disgraced peer's ongoing relationship with Jeffrey Epstein even after the billionaire's 2008 conviction on a child sex charge. And last night he met with MPs to try and convince them to let him hang on. And that appears to have been a success. According to the BBC, Starmer was greeted with cheers as he entered the Westminster meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party, the PLP. And there was even more applause when he used his speech to apologise for his various errors. He also called on MPs to rally round to fight reform, saying, quote, "I've won every fight I've ever been in." And that might have been a little too cocky. After all, this fight is far from over. And even if it's perhaps all he's won is a reprieve, living only to die another day. Energy Secretary Ed Miliband was on BBC Breakfast this morning where he gave his account of the meeting.
Look, in a sense, yesterday was a moment of peril for the Prime Minister. It was, I make no bones about that. But as a collective body, the Cabinet, the Labour Party, looked at the alternatives of going down this road of a chaotic leadership election, trying to depose a Prime Minister, and they said, no, that's not for us. What's for us is focusing on the country, supporting Keir, recognising that serious mistakes have been made, but recognising that he's our leader and he deserves the time and space to renew the government, reset the government, and focus on the country. And I think that is so much the right decision when we think about all the challenges we face.
I love that. He looked around, Ed Miliband looking around, he's saying the PM's in deep trouble. He's looking around, he's looking at his colleagues, over 400 of them. You know what? I don't fancy the others either. Hardly the biggest vote of confidence, is it? In a potential replacement. Says a lot about this Labour government. Mother of the House and suspended Labour MP Diane Abbott gave Channel 4 a very different take on the showdown.
I think that the round of applause in the committee room just now was staged, just as all those endorsements of the Prime Minister, which appeared within 5 minutes of each other, were staged. And I can't see him lasting beyond May's election.
So why are they waiting until May?
Because they're going to be catastrophic elections. And I think the idea is let him stay in there and take responsibility.
Right, but I mean, if you're staring at a disaster, why do you wait for it to happen rather than try and stop it happening?
Well, it's not down to me. You need to speak.
No, I mean, but if that's the dominant mood, I'm just trying to understand it. I mean, you know these people. Why do you think they're thinking that way? Is it that the election losses can't be stopped no matter who the leader is?
Exactly. We're going to have catastrophic results anyway.
The messages Abbott is referring to were the avalanche of supportive tweets put out by cabinet ministers shortly after Scottish Labour leader Sawar called for Starmer to quit. Guido Fawkes was keeping track of when they came out, and as you can see, the entire cabinet posted their identikit statements of support at a rate of roughly one every couple of minutes. That was over the space of an hour. They truly believe we're stupid, or at least too stupid to see what's going on, and that's going to be a problem for Labour at May's elections. Starmer may have the MPs on side, but the public are another story. Here's Diane Abbott again.
But I can tell you that the man and woman on the Stoke Newington High Street is really disgusted that Starmer signed off as somebody to be our ambassador in Washington, someone whose best friend rapes 14-year-olds.
Do you think this is now a zombie government?
I wouldn't call it a zombie government, but we're not going to get much done between now and May.
That is kind of what we mean by a zombie government, isn't it? What I mean is, do you think Keir Starmer is just waiting for the time to go?
Oh, no, I think...
Dead man walking kind of thing.
I think Keir Starmer thinks he can pull it all together, but I don't think he can. What we need to do, because one of the problems with everything that's happened is it confirms people in the idea that MPs are all the same, we're all in it together, and what we need to do is draw a line under that type of thinking, and Keir Starmer isn't the man to do it.
Of course, there were Starmer loyalist MPs making completely the opposite argument. This was Environment Secretary Emma Reynolds, and I'll let you be the judge of just how convincing she was.
Well, I've known Peter for many years. I had no idea about his association with Epstein or some of the things that we discovered last week.
You should have done, because we knew that for years.
The vetting system is clearly something that needs to be
Are you saying that when he came to be ambassador, you didn't realise he'd been friends with Jeffrey Epstein?
Well,
that was well known.
But the association, Peter lied about that in the vetting process. He said he barely knew Jeffrey Epstein.
Yes.
The vetting process definitely needs to change.
Had you not noticed the FT story about him staying in Mandelson's apartment after the conviction?
People saw those reports, but we didn't know the depth of the relationship between the two men. But the Prime Minister is someone who's been fighting for justice for victims of domestic violence for many, many years.
That's what's so mystifying about it. He says he's been fighting for justice,
but he didn't
and yet here was a man who he knew at the time had stayed in Epstein's apartment after his conviction, and he didn't think it was so bad that he couldn't make him
During
ambassador.
the vetting process, Peter Mandelson was asked about this. He said he barely knew Epstein. Keir Starmer,
so you just take his word for it?
Well, Keir Starmer was lied to by Peter Mandelson, and he bitterly regrets the appointment, and he has apologised to the victims.
However much you were going, oh my God, this is ridiculous. Kieran was even worse. Laudable moaning, and quite rightly so, Kieran. Just extraordinary to watch, isn't it? He believed Peter Mandelson, the only person on God's green earth who believes Peter Mandelson, it turns out, is the Prime Minister. A man who had to resign and disgrace twice. A serial liar in politics and public life. But I believed him. These people are so cynical, they've gone full circle and now have the credulity of a small child. Or at least that's what they want you to think. What Reynolds is illustrating there is the real reason MPs are hanging on to Keir Starmer for now. It's because there is almost zero talent in the Parliamentary Labour Party, particularly among more senior MPs, meaning there are few individuals capable of taking on the mantle of leadership, with the benches stuffed full of politically inexperienced former management consultants, think tank types, and apparatchik NGOistas. And from among Starmer's cabinet, many may also be implicated in the Mandelson affair, with more scandal likely to emerge as private communications with the peer are handed to the police, alongside as many as 100,000 government documents on the former ambassador. Kieran, what do you make of the reported response of the Parliamentary Labour Party last night and how they've conducted themselves with this coordinated message of faux spontaneous support for the PM?
Well, at this point, they don't really have much choice, do they? They're over a barrel. Or they have a choice, they could resign. But I think all of this is simply indicative of, first and foremost, look, we're 19 months into the Prime Minister's premiership. 19 months. He won a majority of 175. Just to put that in perspective, Blair in 97 won a majority of 171. we've said it before on this show, we'll say it again. It is utterly astonishing that 19 months into his premiership, he's already a complete lame duck. I know that Diane Abbott was saying it's not quite zombie. I don't really know what her definition of zombie or zombie government is. I would certainly say that he is already a lame duck prime minister. And many of our colleagues have articulated this in different ways over the past few days very well. I suppose I will throw my 2 cents in and say that Starmerism was always a political pyramid scheme. It was always a political pyramid scheme. What pyramid scheme? What's a pyramid scheme? Very simply, buy in, pay fees, no product at the end. And nobody likes to pay fees for something, be promised something, and then realise there's no product at the end of it. And I think that is a large part of why his majority has presumably completely vaporised in 19 short months. That's one thing. Then, of course, there's other points related to that pyramid scheme. Lack of judgment. Outsourcing all of his decision-making to people who have been handpicked over the years by people like Peter Mandelson. Those lapses in judgment aren't really the Prime Minister's lapses in judgment. The lapse of judgment came earlier when he outsourced all of his political decision-making to people like Morgan McSweeney, who was cultivated by Peter Mandelson over the years. And then another thing which speaks to that frankly ridiculous, you rightly said I was groaning all the way through it, that frankly ridiculous interview with Reynolds in the lobby there, Starmer picked stooges to be MPs and promoted stooges to the cabinet. People who will simply, unimaginatively, in a totally idle fashion, follow whatever it is that Starmer and his team wants. I don't doubt there are some talented Labour MPs on the backbenches. I don't doubt that. But certainly the people around him are people that have been handpicked because they are pliant and loyal. And so all of these things, all of these problems are functions of, they are related to the political pyramid scheme that was Starmerism from the very start. This was always about no product. And you can't really, people say, well, he needed to do that to get elected. First of all, I obviously think that's complete dross. But even if that's true, it's an inherently short-sighted scheme because you can't, people form what they think about you and what they think you're about when they first start to see you, either as leader of the opposition or whatever. You can't become Prime Minister and suddenly do a 180 and say, actually, we lied to you in the electoral build-up, in the build-up to the election. We're actually about all of this. So the die was cast from very early on, political pyramid scheme, and I think that explains a lot of the pretty unique problems that he and his government are facing right now.
Yeah, I think that comment about, you look around you and that Ed Miliband made, you look around you, it's like Manchester United dressing room a couple of years ago, right? You're 2-0 down, you're looking around you, you're seeing Jadon Sancho, Anthony, people who don't really turn up or do very much. And I think of, sorry to stretch the football analogy, but then I think of you're looking at Steve Reid, non-entity. You're looking at Peter Carl, non-entity. You're looking at Liz Kendall, non-entity. David Lammy, oh my God. How would these people fare in the private sector? What's their hinterland? What do they read? Who are they? What's the substance? There's nothing there. Liz Kendall got 4.5% in the leadership election. You think she's going to dig you out of this hole? Peter Kyle is meant to be one of the people navigating the future of business in this country. He's never worked. He's never been in business. He has no idea. Now, that's not to say you have to be in business. Maybe you could be a trade unionist and do those jobs, of course. But he has literally no experience in the private sector. He's just been in NGOs. Terrifying. And of course, one talented politician that he could have included was Andy Burnham. He chose not to because he was a threat. That's how they view things. You're right. And I think, we're not going to talk about this too much because it's not the main story, but I think blocking Burnham was the straw that broke the camel's back on this story. Because if you're Scottish Labour, if you're Welsh Labour, you're going to get hammered in May. And basically, that was a message saying, you can sink as long as we stay in control.
Yeah.
Right? That's what the Labour right was saying. Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, the Progress faction, Labour First. They should, of course, be renamed Labour Third, Labour Fourth, Labour Fifth. And that was the message. You can sink as long as we're in charge. And I think that's why Anas Sarwar did what he did. He has to, by the way, because when Labour, if Labour, finished third behind Reform in Holyrood elections in May, that goes on your political epitaph.
Right.
They came behind Reform in Scotland. This is Labour Heartland territory. Ellen Morgan, Labour Wales, was allegedly going to do the same thing. She bottled it. And it makes sense that the two Celtic nations were the ones making the running on this, because they're going to be the parties who are most humiliated come May. At Novara Live, we've been following all of these incredible stories intently this past week, but so has our articles team too, and they've been doing a brilliant job in their coverage. And now you can get a selection of our very best articles delivered into your inbox every Wednesday. All you have to do is sign up to our newsletter, The Pick. Head to novara.media/thepick right now. Do it right now to get it sent straight to your inbox for tomorrow. So easy to do. I love email newsletters. I'm a real sucker for them. You know, I'm always saying, we should buy this or this. And my wife's like, you saw it in an email newsletter, right? I'm saying, yeah, I did. You got me. As ever, we want to know what you think on the show tonight. Send me your thoughts, send me your good vibes, maybe even send a super chat. Of course, we prefer you to support Novara Media through going to novara.media/support, helping us build a new media for different politics. But a super chat doesn't hurt. If you want to do it, do it. 40% goes to Google, Alphabet. But if you want to do it, you do it. We'll read it. Keir Starmer's premiership looks very slightly more secure for now. But that doesn't mean certain leadership contenders aren't on manoeuvres, setting up their paths to power, but biding their time. Last night, Health Secretary Wes Streeting made his first move towards a Downing Street campaign, describing reports of his long friendship with Peter Mandelson as, quote, smears, and declaring himself to have a true understanding of the lessons the government needs to learn. Streeting gains the advantage of being the first to break ranks, and he gains a second advantage by appearing to exercise the kind of transparency so far lacking with Keir Starmer. That's because also last night, Streeting made the text messages and WhatsApp conversations he's had with Mandelson over the past 14 months public. Now, those messages aren't especially revealing, though their publication serves a dual purpose for Streeting. Assuming they're all the messages, they don't show any untoward communications with Mandelson, at least by electronic message. But some of their content is both embarrassing to Starmer's government while separating Streeting from the status quo. Like this exchange from March 2025, beginning with a discussion of Matthew Doyle, at that time the Downing Street Director of Communications, who left the job around that time. Wes Streeting, you should get Doyle to do your comms in DC. Okay, this is something you should tell somebody about, getting somebody to do their comms, but I'm not that close to them, Gov. I mean, you kind of would be, to be on those kinds of terms, no? Lord Mandelson, all my comms have been shut down by number 10. Why was he pushed out? Wes Streeting, God knows. The government problems do not stem from comms. Just quickly on this chat, before we go to the rest of these messages, Matthew Doyle has now been elevated to the House of Lords. He's attracted a lot of criticism because he was campaigning for a Labour councillor to be re-elected in 2017 who had actually already been charged with possession of images of children, found guilty of possession of sexual images of children, including a girl as young as 10. He'd been charged with that. Doyle was campaigning for him. There is a pattern here, guys. I don't mean to sound all Alex Jones and QAnon. There is a pattern that clearly very senior people in the Labour Party do not care about child sexual exploitation. I don't mean to sound, I'm not trying, it's not clickbait. If that happened, if somebody in Novara Media was campaigning for somebody who'd been charged with that kind of offence, and then they were saying, can you give me a really serious job like being a legislator for life, which is what the House of Lords is, you'd probably say, look, come back in 10 years. I don't think your judgment's very good. It doesn't warrant that kind of position. That would be what I think anyway. I think that's pretty normal. Let's go on with that exchange. Wes Streeting, quite. I fear we're in big trouble here. And I'm toast at the next election. We just lost our safest ward in Redbridge, 51% Muslim, Ilford South, to a Gaza independent. Constituencies are comprised of various electoral wards. At this rate, I don't think we'll hold either of the two Ilford seats. There isn't a clear answer to the question. Why Labour? Lord Mandelson, the government doesn't have an economic philosophy which is then followed through in a programme of policies. Wes Streeting, no growth strategy at all. Another exchange saw Streeting criticise the government over Gaza in late July last year. Wes Streeting, I'm sure this will come up in coming days, so wanted to check in with you on recognition of Palestine and the domestic politics of it. Keir's statement today was excellent, but Macron's statement tonight ups the ante. Morally and politically, I think we need to join France. Morally, because Israel is committing war crimes before our eyes, their government talks the language of ethnic cleansing, and I've met with our own medics out there who describe the most chilling and distressing scenes of calculated brutality against women and children. Politically, a Commons vote will be engineered in September on recognition, and we will lose it if we're not ahead of it. There are no circumstances in which people like me or Shabana Mahmood, who is a Birmingham MP, could abstain or vote against, for example. Conference will be a sea of Palestinian flags and the moderates will be waving them. We need to be leading the charge on this. The alternative is being dragged there with enormous damage to Keir, the government and the party. I've never been a shrinking violet on Israel. I've supported LFI, Labour Friends of Israel, for over 20 years. Our sister party, Haaretz, and progressives are clear about what's being done in their name and they oppose it. Our sister party, as in the Israeli Labour Party, Haaretz being the paper of record in Israel, but also a centre-left newspaper. I appreciate these things are always more complicated than they appear to those of us who aren't up close as you are. And I also appreciate how much Keir and David are giving to this personally. That's David Lammy. But it is what it is. We need to lead, not follow. This is Lord Mandelson in response to quite extraordinary claims made by Streeting. I can see all this, but I am worried that such a gesture, because apparently recognising Palestine is just a gesture, could blow a two-state solution out of the water. I think he says 2SS, doesn't he? If Israel decided that unilateral recognition justified further West Bank annexation, which the US would be powerless to stop, or reverse. Apparently the US would be powerless to stop, literally just stop sending them money. Anyway, that would be the end of it. So I think we need to employ practical means to get a two-state solution. Not quickly, I grant, but realistically. The Palestinian Authority, with reform and new leadership, can advance this with Arab, US, European support. The alternative is a further deadlocked death spiral on an even greater scale than now, where Streeting, Israel is doing it anyway. Wes Streeting goes on to say, this is rogue state behaviour. Let them pay the price as pariahs with sanctions applied to the state, not just a few ministers. Extraordinary. One of the most high prominent supporters of Israel within the Labour cabinet saying, apply sanctions to Israel. If I say that on TV, I get called an anti-Semite. I have been. Lord Mandelson, well, I don't make government policy. I can only help implement it. So my views are between us. Wes Streeting, absolutely. Not shooting the messenger. It's very helpful in trying to understand what Keir is weighing up as he balances all the risks and considerations that aren't necessarily obvious to the rest of us. So thank you. That conversation continued the following day. How are you feeling now? So they're talking over multiple days. How are you feeling? I mean, again, this is what friends do. Wes Streeting, extremely concerned. Keir's statement has been received as boxing himself in. We are headed straight into a summer of angst. SO24 debate and engineered vote on recognition in September. If whipped resignations at every level, as in, I suppose, government, right? Cabinet, but also, would people leave the Labour Party? I have no idea. I presume at every level, that's what he means. Resignations at every level, conference dominated by this. The discontent isn't just from the left of the PLP, it's from moderates, true. Will be on a bigger scale than welfare and could prove fatal, also true. Lord Mandelson, if those events unfolded, it would certainly convince the public that we are unfit for government. By the way, this is really a big deal. This is all correct. Resistance to what Israel was doing by ordinary people created this level of crisis within the party of government in this country, which is extraordinary. We'll return to that in a moment. I'll ask you about that in a minute, Kieran. What does the PLP think would follow from announcing recognition? Wes Streeting, nothing in practice, but the symbolism matters against the backdrop of what we're seeing. Lord Mandelson got it. So you've got Streeting's messages that seem to pitch him to the left of Starmer's government, while also stating a much clearer moral message on Gaza. No doubt he'll be hoping that does him some favours with his constituency. But the cabinet hasn't taken Streeting's intervention very well. At number 10 was last night briefing that Streeting was engaged in a coup against Starmer. And according to Guido Fawkes, some in number 10 were encouraging the PM to sack the health secretary. One number 10 insider told the Daily Telegraph this. Today's events were so clearly manipulated and coordinated by the Wes Streeting campaign, but they catastrophically failed when he bottled it by not resigning too. He doesn't have the kind of support he thinks he does, and today proves it, not least because of his very close and long-standing relationship with Peter Mandelson. That's pretty concerning if you're Wes Streeting, that somebody inside Number 10 is already briefing that you're closely associated with Peter Mandelson, which of course he is. Now, going back to Streeting's article, here's what he says about his relationship with Mandelson. Contrary to what has been widely reported, I was not a close friend of Peter Mandelson, but I'm not going to wash my hands of my actual association with him either. Mandelson and I saw each other for dinner on average once a year in a group setting. He offered advice. By the way, it's quite a lot when you're a busy person. He offered advice. There's some friends I haven't seen for more than a year. My partner worked for him 25 years ago and therefore got to know him better than others of that generation in politics, a generation I've always admired since I joined the Labour Party as a 15-year-old in 1998. Now, you'll forgive me if I don't believe any of this. Please forgive me. I'm not saying Streeting is lying. It may well be true that he and Mandelson only met once a year for dinner. I think I've been for dinner with the best man at my wedding once in the last 2 years. But I don't think you, as a cabinet minister, write the kind of confessional and potentially incendiary messages about your own prime minister to Peter Mandelson, a man known to be the master of dark arts without a high level of trust. And we also know that Mandelson was very keen on Streeting becoming prime minister. A year ago, Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund published a long read in the Times about how Streeting was being groomed for leadership of the opposition during Keir Starmer's 2022 Big 8 drama. In the article, they report this following a negative reaction to Streeting's leadership manoeuvring from the rest of the Labour shadow cabinet. As Streeting complained to friends that he was more talked about than talked to, Peter Mandelson allegedly took it upon himself to canvass the shadow cabinet. One of its members recalled the Prince of Darkness making the case for Wes, declaring over the phone, quote, "He's brave, he's great on the media, he's got the ideas." What ideas? She rejected the entreaty out of hand, blending the menace and theatricality for which he was famed. Mandelson is said to have deadpanned, "You're a very cruel woman." He would later insist the conversation had not happened. Liquid Peter Mandelson. Presumably, most people aren't working to get someone into the Labour Party's top job without knowing them pretty well. And that ambition that Mandelson appears to have had for Streeting seems to occur again in the messages Streeting has just revealed. This is Mandelson's last message to Streeting after his sacking as ambassador, one that Streeting appears not to have replied to. Lord Mandelson, shared with you by a Times subscriber, enjoy this article for free. Who is Rob Jetton, the Liberal vying to be the youngest Dutch PM? Like Wes Streeting, Rob Jetton is a young gay man and leader of the Liberal Democrats' 66 party in the Netherlands. In late 2025, Jetton's party narrowly won the Dutch election, with Jetton set to become the first gay prime minister in the country over the coming weeks. I love that. They're tight. They send messages to one another to the extent that Mandelson is sending him messages after being richly humiliated and defenestrated in full public view, and Streeting just doesn't reply. There's a few things that I want to talk about here. Streeting is saying there's no growth strategy, which is the line that's going to be picked up by most of the media, by opposition politicians over the coming months. They're going to say, you've got no growth strategy. Your own health secretary thinks that. So I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about the fact that, we've heard for years now, the protests aren't doing anything. Why are you protesting? Why every week? Why the campaigns? Why BDS? Why are you giving such a hard time to Labour MPs? Literally, there's your reason why. Because MPs in private are saying, look, I've got to recognise Palestine. I'm out of a job, pal. Which is true, by the way. He's out of a job. Probably is anyway. Maybe we pick up on that second point, because I think this is something very close to your heart.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it confirms two things. First of all, as you say, Aaron, that the pro-Palestine movement has grown to such a degree over the past 15, 20 years, particularly since October 7th and the beginning of the all-out genocide in Gaza, has grown to such a degree that it really does eat away at politicians behind closed doors. And however much that might be invisible or invisibilized by the formal rhetoric of power, by the impression that the Israel lobby wants to give to us, by needling prime ministers and their closest courtiers and their outriders in the media. There are very, very serious, tangible, material gains that have been made by the pro-Palestine movement in this country and elsewhere over the past 2 years particularly, but 15, 20 years if you want to take the longer view. That's a really significant thing. And it comes at a moment, I think, when unfortunately, because of the nature of the news cycle, mainstream media news cycle, legacy media news cycle, fewer and fewer people are being reminded day after day about Palestine. And of course, Gaza has been turned into such a desolate wasteland that it is easy for people to feel completely hopeless. It's easy for people to switch off and think, well, nothing we did saved a single hair on a single person's head. That's fair enough. That's a reasonable thing to think when you look at the, as I say, desolate wasteland of Gaza. But this shows that actually we are closer than we think to influencing government policy. And it's consistent with what I've said many times on this show, which is that the reason the Israel lobby exists to the extent that it does now is because of the failing of former Israeli propaganda, which worked without the muscle, which convinced the world that Israel was good and righteous and romantic and idealistic, and they didn't need to use the beefed up Israel lobby to break people's thumbs, metaphorically, behind closed doors to get to say certain things. This shows that we are advancing, that we're working, and that should be something that everybody takes to heart. The second thing I would say is that it shows that Wes Streeting, unequivocally, it shows that Wes Streeting put his own career ahead of his principles. And of course, I know he leaked all of this, rather published it, not leaked it, openly published it, to make himself look good, to try and save his prospects as a future prime minister, which is obviously what you don't need to be a political analyst, though, that's what he was trying to do. But of course, implicit in those messages is that he knew, like you said, they're telling the truth in those messages. They're telling the truth. But they're not saying it publicly, they're saying it in a private message exchange. And so what it does is it actually exposes the cynicism of Wes Streeting, because it shows that what he's trying to do is save his career publicly. He's trying to save his career by releasing messages which privately show that he knows that what Israel is doing are war crimes, heaped upon war crimes, but publicly is helping Israel whitewash a genocide. I mean, that is, make no mistake, that's what Wes Streeting has done.
But also Mandelson recognises what's going on, right? But he then says, well, recognition won't help with the two-state solution. But he recognises fundamentally that there are war crimes and basically there's an entire nation being killed here. And we can talk about maybe Streeting is so calculating and whatnot that he published, he's published messages that he thought he might have to publish. They were in his back pocket. He wrote this at the time in order to sort of manipulate certain audiences as an insurance policy, maybe. But Mandelson wasn't doing that. And Mandelson, that's the crazy thing. Mandelson's basically like, yeah, it's war crimes. But, we shouldn't adopt that strategy because it doesn't make any difference.
Really briefly, Aaron, on that, what Mandelson is saying is totally consistent with the Blairite line in the early 2000s, middle 2000s. It's really remarkable reading that stuff. He hasn't moved on from the Blair view of a two-state solution. And it's actually quite interesting to see that. Actually, I would have guessed, and I'd be wrong about this, that behind closed doors and trusted parties, Peter Mandelson speaks the language of total realpolitik when it comes to Israel. But actually, in a way, it's worse than that. He is stuck in the middle 2000s with exactly the kind of jargon and rhetoric that Blair's government repeated over and over again in regards to the two-state solution.
We just need a moderate person in charge of the Palestinian Authority and the two-state solution and work together and stop the death spiral. Liberals have been talking about a two-state solution since Oslo, since the early 1990s, precisely so they don't actually have to talk about the reality of the situation. We all want a two-state solution. No, you don't. Your actions and your words aren't aligned because you're using that in order to not do something quite concrete when tens of thousands of people, maybe far more than that, are being killed, when 16,000 kids are being killed, when a small strip of land, tiny strip of land, is being pounded with more munitions than London, Hamburg, And I think Berlin combined over the whole of the Second World War, one tiny strip of land. We have to have a two-state solution. There's a political impetus for saying that. It's to not talk about this other ginormous thing, which Streeting says out loud. Quickly on the growth strategy, because I think that's the line that, we're talking about stuff that's relevant today, but that's the line that Telegraph columnists and Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage are going to return to for weeks and months and maybe even years.
Yeah. Again, it's true. There is no industrial strategy or growth strategy, but we can not expect one from Prime Minister Wes Streeting either. Wes Streeting, it's impossible to know what he would do in government because he hasn't, as Prime Minister, because he hasn't been Prime Minister. But what we can say is that he has always spoken the language of neoliberalism. He's always talked about the importance of fiscal rules. Now, he would say this is collective responsibility. Of course I had to. But he's always talked Reeves's language and previous austerity Tory government's language of fiscal rules. He's made that very consistently front and centre in what he's said. Fiscal rules, of course, have massively constrained what Rachel Reeves has allowed herself to invest and to spend on public services and a stimulated growth strategy. He talks about the NHS as a driver of growth rather than just merely a public service. No, nothing wrong with drivers of growth, but when they're public goods, when people start talking like that, it's a short garden path to greater privatisation. It just is, because public goods are you're supposed to build in the inevitability that sometimes your public goods and your public services will lose money. They're counter-cyclical. They carry on running.
Well, not just that, but lots of people being sick is a great money spinner. If you think of something like OxyContin in the United States,
right?
That, in terms of, you look at GDP stats, having millions of people taking opioids that they don't need to be taking is great for growth. It's not so great for the people that then become opioid addicts. So
exactly,
crazy mindsets apply to healthcare of all things.
For sure. So I think that's a huge red flag. A huge red flag for anybody who thinks that Prime Minister Wes Streeting, I'm sure no Novara listeners or viewers do, would be serious about a Keynesian style or something growth strategy led by government. He's just never, ever demonstrated any of the qualities that would reassure someone that is what he actually wants to do. And again, he's flip-flopped on so many things. I mean, Blair, the guy was 11 years ago was saying that, 12 years ago was saying Tony Blair should have no place anywhere near politics because of the war in Iraq. Now he falls over himself to, invite him back into the fold. So it's impossible to believe him any more than it was possible to believe Keir Starmer.
I think quickly on the growth strategy thing, you've got two options, right? Either it's more state spending. Pretty fair to say that Wes Streeting doesn't favour that. If he does, great. I certainly don't think Peter Mandelson does. Either more state spending, or you're going to have more deregulation. You don't do, reform around workers' rights, North Sea oil, fracking, right? That's the kind of reform growth strategy. I don't agree with it, but it's probably is a growth strategy, right, in the short to medium term. I don't agree with it. I think the downsides massively outweigh any advantages, but or you do like Corbynism, McDonnellism. I don't know what their quote growth strategy actually is. With the creation of the Epstein library, the now deceased paedophile financier has understandably become a global news story again. But some journalists have been on this trail for quite a while. One of them is Richard Sanders. In 2019, he produced an episode of Dispatches, broadcast on Channel 4, titled The Prince and the Paedophile. That was the first video report broadcast in this country, attempting to detail the nature of the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Prince Andrieu. I caught up with Richard earlier today for a wide-ranging interview on Epstein, Virginia Giuffre, who he spoke to multiple times, Peter Mandelson, Ghislaine Maxwell, and Donald Trump. Richard Sanders, welcome to Novara Live.
Thank you.
Very happy to have you on.
Lovely to be here.
You are somebody with a finger in many editorial pies over the years. One of them being this Dispatches episode you made in 2019 with Channel 4, Cathy Newman. You are familiar with the issues, the personalities. You even met Virginia Giuffre. What was she like? Who was she?
Right. So first of all, I never met Virginia. Virginia lived in Australia. Okay. What happened was I made the film with Cathy Newman, which went out before the infamous Prince Andrew interview in 2019. In the wake of that, I established contact with Virginia, and I had a series of very long conversations with Virginia. So it was a telephone relationship we had. She was in Australia with a very poor sense of time zones. She'd ring up at sort of 2 a.m. for a chat, and you'd say, oh, yeah, you know. She was great. She was very funny. She was very smart. She was very resilient. And she was very bouncy at that time. I mean, you know, I think at that time she felt quite exhilarated. Everything was finally coming out into the open. And she was absolutely fascinating. She was quite an intelligent, insightful person. And she was a really fascinating sort of entry point onto that world of Jeffrey Epstein. Although I subsequently realized, of course, she was one of the people who didn't matter. She was one of the little people around. And I've been, to a degree, surprised by the degree to which Epstein clearly is at the heart of this web of relationships and everything. I'd kind of had a sense of someone who inflated his own importance, but it's clear it was true.
You first spoke to her in 2019, or before that?
Yes, it would have been at the end of 2019, after our film went out. So I had a series of long conversations with her through the end of 2019 and through 2020. We were going to interview her in Miami in March 2020, and then COVID intervened, unfortunately.
What was her story? How did she connect with you?
Right. Well, no, she'd seen the film, and she was very, pleased with the film, very impressed with the film. The film was the first thing on British television about Jeffrey Epstein. I'd initially come across Jeffrey Epstein. I was doing Trump with Matt Fry for Channel 4. I made a whole series of films about Trump with Matt Fry for Channel 4. Now, when you started looking into Trump, and this is the end of 2015, start of 2016, you very quickly bumped into Jeffrey Epstein, okay? And so I was sort of whittering onto people from back then, 2016, we really ought to do a story about this fella. There was a book called Filthy Rich published in 2016. It's not some mystery, Epstein. People had worked out that deal done in 2008 was an absolute scandal. So we made our film. Now, what happened was, and you can see this in the Netflix series about the Emily Maitlis interview, that what happens is...
With Prince Andrew.
With Prince Andrew, about Prince Andrew. Our film was called The Prince and the Paedophile. Now, what happens is Prince Andrew watches our film. You have a sequence in the Netflix series where he's sitting there watching our film, and he makes the catastrophic calculation that, I need to get my side of the story out there. And, let's get that Maitlis woman on the phone. So we smoked him out. Our film was the reason he did the film. He did the interview with Emily Maitlis. Yes, and then Virginia saw it. Because I'd been trying to get in touch with Virginia to be in our film, and it proved impossible. But then we did establish contact immediately.
Why did it prove impossible? Did she not want to do those kinds of appearances?
It was interesting. At that point, it was very difficult. It's an interesting film because we're very pleased with the film. It had a big impact. It doesn't actually have any of the victims in it. They were still very wary. It was all still terribly delicate at that point. People were still very wary. She was in Australia as well, which was an additional problem. So it was very tricky. We actually simply used clips of her talking to NBC, so she was in the film. In any case,
you've got this book of hers, Nobody's Girl, by your side. It's an interesting transition then to not appearing in your film in 2019, this breakthrough film in terms of the UK conversation around Epstein. She doesn't appear in that, to several years later publishing a book. Did she ever sort of explain that trajectory to you? Did she sort of give up on this story seeing the light of day and gradually get a bit of confidence, a bit of momentum that actually there may be a modicum of justice for her and the other victims?
Yes, but to a degree that had already happened. It was just sort of logistics and so on that meant she didn't talk to us. I mean, her story really begins, she escapes Epstein in the summer of 2002. She persuades them to send her on a course to Thailand to study massage. There she meets this Australian guy, falls in love and goes to Australia and rings up Epstein and says, sorry, I'm not coming back. He says, have a good life, and hangs the phone up. She goes off to Australia, has, this idyllic life. I think in retrospect, it's clear it's not idyllic, but she's escaped. In any case, she's having children. She has 3 children in the end. And then one day in 2007, the phone rings and the whole thing intrudes back into her life once the Palm Beach police are looking into the situation in Florida. at that time, and they start talking to her, and it's quite gradual. There's a woman called Sharon Churcher from the Mail who gets in touch with her, and about 2011, I think she does the first interviews. The famous photo, I think, comes out for the first time in 2011. It goes all the way back to there. So it's quite a gradual process of her story gradually being propelled to the fore.
So she possibly wants to forget about it, put it to the back of her mind, move on. Did she realise at the time what was happening? I mean, you said she got away. So
Right. So the thing about Virginia, and she'd say this herself, she was primed for abuse. All right.
Yeah.
If you people like Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein, they have an instinct. They can smell vulnerable girls. All right. Ghislaine homed in on Virginia. She met her at Mar-a-Lago where she was working, and she sort of homed in on her. You know, if you read Virginia's autobiography, her posthumous autobiography, which I'd recommend people do read, it's an extraordinary book. She's abused from the age of 7. You know, Virginia's life is a story of just endlessly repeating cycles of abuse. So by the time she gets to, you know, she turns up to give this massage. She thinks this might be great because she wants to be a masseuse. You know, that's what she wants to do. She thinks that's the job I want to do. She's sort of 15, 16 at the time. And she thinks, oh, gosh, this rich man, this is an opportunity. She is recruited by Ghislaine. This is absolutely crucial. And Virginia was always incredibly angry at the female enablers around Epstein. He surrounded himself by a group of female enablers, of which the most important was Ghislaine Maxwell. But she always called her Mary fucking Poppins. She said if that English woman with her posh English accent hadn't talked, I'd never have gone to that man's house otherwise if it hadn't been for that.
Well, there are other sort of female enablers you talked about.
Quite a few.
Are they on the record or in the book?
They are. Let's not get ourselves sued, but there's a number of others. Yeah, I mean, there's his assistant, who was his assistant for 20 years, who's organising every aspect of his life. There's 2 or 3 others, and you have this rather complicated thing. And to a degree, this happens with Virginia, and she's very honest about this in the book, where people begin as victims. Now, once you hit 17, 18, Jeffrey's not terribly interested in you, okay? And at that point, you can merge into the sort of household staff, and at which point you become an enabler and a facilitator. And you know, this is one of the awkward things about Virginia's story, and she's very open about this, that she started recruiting girls for him. Now, she says, I was always very honest with them. I always told them what it entailed. But she was racked with guilt about that she had recruited girls for Jeffrey.
So how does Ghislaine Maxwell meet her at Mar-a-Lago? You're saying she's 15, 16. What's she doing at Mar-a-Lago?
She's got a job. I think it's in the massage section. She's on the desk anyway. She's on the sort of front desk, and she's sitting there reading a book about massage. She's not actually doing massages, but she's on the sort of front desk for people who are turning up for massages. So she's being employed by Trump at that time. Mar-a-Lago is just around the corner from Epstein's place in Palm Beach, and he and Ghislaine were in and out of Mar-a-Lago all the time. Epstein and Trump in the 90s. And the beginning of the 2000s were very close. They were real buddies, and they went out. They womanized together. That was their sort of bond. I'm not sure how close the financial connection was between the two of them. And Trump, the latest tranche of emails and Epstein files are as significant for what's not in them as for what is in them. All right. When you think of what is in them, just imagine what's not in those 2.5 million files they haven't released. And my guess would be there's a fair bit of Trump. You know, there isn't a single Trump email to or from Trump in the tranche that's been released. Now, they seem to have fallen out around 2007, so it may be that there are fewer emails. The emails only begin in 2000. If you look at the Epstein files, they only begin in 2000. So there's a whole chunk, the whole 90s, when Epstein is committing all sorts of crimes, which are not in those files. And it may be that Trump gets off slightly lightly because the relationship ended in 2007.
Well, that was Richard Sanders speaking to me earlier today. We'll be putting out the full version of that interview tomorrow. It's about an hour. And I have to say, that wasn't the most interesting stuff there. It was chock-a-block with a really, really important insights that you just don't see anywhere else. As I said at the top of that, he was involved in the first bit of journalism that got this conversation going. It was the thing he made with Kathy Newman at Channel 4. Great at Channel 4, by the way. They made that video, The Prince and the Paedophile, that smoked out Prince Andrew. And then, of course, as was just said there, he speaks to Emily Maitlis. And from there, you get a snowball, really, of this whole thing as a UK story. Central moment in all of this happening. Richard Sanders, great journalist, not just for his work on this stuff either.
Fantastic journalist. And he wouldn't mind me saying this. I think he has found himself excommunicated by many of his colleagues in the mainstream or legacy media, and as a result has found himself on the peripheries of, the media, broadcast media landscape. And I think that is testament to the fact that he does his job properly. He really does his job properly. He really goes after power. That old Socratic idea of, a journalist or whatever being a gadfly, flying around, buzzing around the face of power, winding it up. So few journalists actually do that, and he really, really does. And so I think he's been exiled for that reason. But yeah, fantastic. I was lucky enough to be in the room when you conducted the whole interview with him, Aaron, and it's well worth a watch.
Yeah, really, 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 really talented man. I mean, the Labour files, amazing. I mean, he was responsible for episode 2 of that, right?
Yeah.
Again, we have had so many clues about the kind of man Keir Starmer was, and so much of the media simply wasn't interested. This story as well on Mandelson, right? Only really the FT covered the leaked JP Morgan report from 2023 detailing Epstein's friendship with Mandelson, how deep it went. Most of the rest of the media wasn't interested because, of course, if you talk about this stuff, you lose access. We've got some breaking news for you now. Really important story, this. It's about Matthew Doyle, the former Downing Street comms director we were discussing a moment ago. He was made a Lord late last year by Keir Starmer. He was the Downing Street comms director for, I think, about 8 months. Deeply enmeshed within these circles on the Labour right, was attending monthly supper clubs, allegedly, with Roger Liddell and Peter Mandelson when Corbyn was the Labour leader. He was part of a coterie of people trying to turn things around. I think we can get up a tweet now, just detailing what's happened. This is from Politics UK. It's being reported very widely. Breaking, Labour has suspended Matthew Doyle, the former Director of Communications to Keir Starmer, until last year, and now peer, over links to a convicted sex offender. So he's, I think, lost the whip as a peer, in other words. Doyle campaigned for Sean Morton, an ex-Labour councillor in Moray, Scotland, after the candidate was charged with possessing indecent images of children in December 2016. Morton later admitted sex offences. Now, I know a bit about the story because I've written about it. And I've talked about it. I was on GB News last week saying Starmer doesn't seem to care about this stuff, right? Because he was campaigning for this person in 2017, I believe, who actually wasn't running as a Labour candidate anymore because at that point, Labour was controlled, of course, by Jeremy Corbyn's lot. They weren't particularly tied to any faction on the right, so I think they were just treating this quite judiciously and correctly. He wasn't running as a Labour candidate, running as an independent. Doyle didn't just campaign with him, he actually went to the election count, right? And this person was being charged with possession of images of children. He was campaigning with him, went to the election count. Not arrested even, right? Which is bad. I think you probably shouldn't associate with somebody that's arrested for something like that. Charged with. This is a statement from Matthew Doyle. I want to apologise for my past association with Sean Morton. His offences were vile, and I completely condemn the actions for which he was rightly convicted. My thoughts are with the victims and all those impacted by these crimes. At the point of my campaigning support, Morton repeatedly asserted to all those who knew him his innocence, including initially in court. He later changed his plea in court to guilty. To not cease support ahead of a judicial conclusion was a clear error of judgment, for which I apologise unreservedly. Those of us who took him at his word were clearly mistaken. I've never sought to dismiss or diminish the seriousness of the offences for which he was clearly convicted, or rightly convicted rather. They are clearly abhorrent, and I've never questioned his conviction. Following his conviction, any contact was extremely limited. What does that really mean? And I've not seen or spoken to him in years. A reminder, this was 8 to 9 years ago. So again, years quite loose. When was the last time you spoke to him? Twice I was at events organised by the people, which he attended. And once I saw him to check on his welfare after concerns were raised through others. I acted to try to ensure the welfare of a troubled individual whilst fully condemning the crimes which he has been convicted and being clear that my thoughts are with the victims of his crime. I'm sorry about the mistakes I've made. For the avoidance of any doubts, let me conclude where I started. Morton's crimes are vile and my only concerns are for his victims. That is really extraordinary. So he's lost the whip, but he's actually saying, I've hung out with this guy multiple times since it happened. I mean, presumably that's going to come out at some point. That's my presumption. We don't know. One reading, I should say, is that Labour's trying to get ahead of a story because this is of a piece now where it looks like Keir Starmer doesn't care about this stuff, right? Whether it's with child grooming gangs, which has obviously been a huge political issue. Range of opinions on that. Of course, he wasn't in politics even when that was a major story at the start of the 2010s. There's that. There's this story on Sean Morton and then making Doyle a lord and, of course, making Mandelson this country's ambassador to Washington. There's a pattern, right?
There is, and I think I can't answer what you said earlier, Aaron, which is that it is pretty clear that there are a lot of people in the high-ranking Labour Party and the corridors of power generally. I mean, let's not make this a thing about Labour, that do not care about the welfare of children and that see it as part and parcel of a political parlour game. See the victims of child sex abuse or rape as totally disposable if it stands in the way of their political strategic ambitions and goals. That is, I think, undeniable. And it's an increasingly clear picture that's emerging of that. It's a highly disturbing one. And I think really overall what this points to is a nihilism. There's only so many times you can say cynicism. There is a nihilism at the heart of this government. There is a nihilism in public life. There is a nihilism, a belief in nothing that is eroding and wearing on our institutions. And that's extremely disturbing. It's an extremely disturbing set of circumstances. And unfortunately, the more we know about this, the more that is confirmed.
Yeah, I mean, he went to the election count as well. Sometimes you have to be charitable with these things, don't you? I'm not suggesting in this particular instance, but somebody does a bad thing and other people are associated with them and you get guilt by association. It happened with Corbyn all the time, didn't it? Okay. This is horrific. This is a horrific crime to be charged with, not arrested on, charged with. And I know he's saying he maintained his innocence and so on, and friends lie to you, and that happens. He went to the election count with him, right? He wasn't just campaigning with him alongside a broad range of people. He went to the election count of a guy who'd literally been suspended from Labour, who's standing as an independent. So everybody else is taking it seriously, except you. If that isn't pause for thought, I don't know what would be. This is from the FT on the timing. People briefed on the matter said Starmer wanted to, quote, look again at the conduct of Doyle, who resigned as Downing Street Director of Communications last March after 9 months in the job. They said the Prime Minister was, quote, not aware that Doyle had campaigned for Sean Morton, who admitted having indecent images of children in November 2017. Again, that was all in the public domain. This is getting ridiculous now. He wasn't aware of Mandelson's friendship with Epstein. He wasn't aware of this. I was aware of it. I'm not the Prime Minister. I'm not the person deciding he's going to become an unelected legislator for life. If you're not aware when giving that kind of position to somebody, that's on you, right? That's your failing. What's your response to that comment of he wasn't aware?
My response is quite simply that either way you look at this, excuse my language, he's fucked. Morally and probably politically. Because, like you say, if he wasn't aware, he wasn't doing his due diligence. I mean, it's implausible to me that he wasn't aware. But if he wasn't aware, he wasn't doing his due diligence, which is fatal for somebody who occupies the highest public office in the country to not be aware of things that you and I were aware of. So that's number one. Number two, he was aware. This is the other scenario. I'm not saying this is the case. He was aware in scenario 2, and he went ahead with the appointments nonetheless. Either way, it is extremely damning.
What is he aware of? I mean, good question. What are you aware of, Keir Starmer? Right now, what is at the forefront of your mind? If it's not stuff like that, and he's saying, I want to bring integrity back into politics. Well, if you're going to do that, you have to be aware of stuff. I'm going to bring ethical conduct back into public life, and the minute people are being unethical, well, I didn't know. Well, how else is it going to happen? The trove of 3 million Jeffrey Epstein documents published online by the US Department of Justice continues to yield increasingly shocking revelations about the dead sex trafficker billionaire's links to the very rich and the even more powerful. Today, we've had yet another suggestion, and one that hits close to home. This is Prince Andrew biographer Andrew Lowney speaking to Daily Mail journalist Sarah Vine, who also happens to be the ex-wife of former Tory minister Michael Gove.
I have heard of all sorts of threesomes, including a threesome with Ghislaine and a British Prime Minister.
Oh, my goodness. A recent British Prime Minister?
A former British Prime Minister. It's not Winston Churchill.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, fine. Okay, well, I think the lawyers would cut that out if we went any further on that.
Now, Lowney doesn't say who the third participant in that threesome was alleged to be. Lowney, however, did go a little further on Talk TV.
But let's start with that shocking revelation that you came out with in the last few days, implying, and I quote, that somewhere in the files there will come to pass the information that a past British Prime Minister, and children's ears, had a threesome with Jeffrey Epstein and a call girl. I mean, one begs to, I'm not going to ask, I'm just going to say, how shocking more is this story going to get?
Well, I think it has still some way to go. I mean, I've known about the story about the former Prime Minister for some time, but I see that actually it is in the files. There is a release there. People don't seem to have picked it up, but actually there's an FBI correspondence discussing it. So I'm sure that name will eventually appear.
I don't know what to say. Sorry, it wasn't it was with Ghislaine Maxwell, just to put it all into, is what it says here with Ghislaine Maxwell. There we go.
Now, we haven't been able to find the document that Lowney is talking about in that clip, but Lowney is also vague enough that it isn't clear whether he's talking about someone who had a threesome with Epstein and Maxwell while Prime Minister or someone who became Prime Minister after the Sex Act. Now, we know that Ghislaine Maxwell met Epstein sometime in the 1990s in New York. In 1996, a young woman called Maria Farmer reported Epstein and Maxwell to the FBI, saying they'd abused her younger sister Annie a year earlier. At that time, Maxwell was in her early 30s, around a decade since she graduated from Oxford. Here's where it gets really interesting. The earliest sex act between Epstein, Maxwell, and a future or past Prime Minister could have taken place probably around then. So we're thinking mid-1990s. But while at Oxford, Maxwell had connections to at least 2 future Prime Ministers. This is the iconic 1987 Bullingdon Club photograph showing the members of the infamously posh and destructive drinking club. Second from the left in the top row is David Cameron, and first from the bottom of those seated is Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson and Ghislaine Maxwell both attended Balliol College. According to Johnson's sister, Rachel, she once walked into the college's junior common room to see Ghislaine Maxwell holding court, her high-heeled boot resting on the future PM's thigh. Johnson has never discussed his relationship with Maxwell. David Cameron was at Oxford at the same time too, though his college was Brasenose. And Cameron is mentioned several times in the Epstein files, though there is no correspondence directly between him and Jeffrey Epstein. In fact, this is a piece of advice Epstein gave Peter Mandelson while he was a minister in Gordon Brown's government. It's sent a few months before the 2010 election that put the Conservative Lib Dem coalition into government. From Jeffrey Epstein to Peter Mandelson, you need to go after David Cameron and not the party. Chop off the head. If you can, in experience, the last thing the country needs is an untested captain. The rough waters are going to need seasoned hands. Did you take B3? We think that's about vitamin B3, but anyway, it could be code, who knows. Now, in making these connections, we're not suggesting any wrongdoing. We have literally no idea who Lowney is referring to. But the relationships do show, I think at least, the kind of elite British contacts that Ghislaine Maxwell had access to and that she brought with her when she paired up with Jeffrey Epstein. So I think Lowney is right. There's a lot more to come from these files, with a lot of the British establishment probably feeling pretty on edge. But right now, Ghislaine isn't talking. Maxwell, who's been sentenced to 20 years in prison for sex trafficking, appeared before the US House Oversight Committee yesterday. They didn't get very far.
Ms. Maxwell, were you a close friend and confidant of Jeffrey Epstein? I would like to answer your question, but on the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer this question and any related questions. My habeas petition is pending in the Southern District of New York. I therefore invoke my right to silence under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Let the record reflect that Ms. Maxwell has invoked the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. Ms. Maxwell, please be very clear. Are you declining to answer the question put to you solely on the ground that you believe the answer will incriminate you?
I invoke my Fifth Amendment right to silence.
Maxwell pled the fifth on every question put to her, but her answers may yet come, though at a price. Through a lawyer, Maxwell has now said she will answer the House's questions openly and honestly in exchange for clemency from US President Donald Trump. And her lawyer sweetened Maxwell's offer to Trump with this. If this committee and the American public truly want to hear the unfiltered truth about what happened, there is a straightforward path. Ms. Maxwell is prepared to speak fully and honestly if granted clemency by President Trump. Presumably a reduced sentence. Only she can provide the complete account. Some may not like what they hear, but the truth matters. For example, both President Trump and President Clinton are innocent of any wrongdoing. Ms. Maxwell alone can explain why, and the public is entitled to that explanation. I'll get back to that in a moment, Kieran. But on the UK angle here, I mean, I think a lot of people are looking at the emphasis on Britain's role in this saga. It is a saga, it's an ongoing thing, isn't it? Prince Andrew over many years, now more recently Peter Mandelson. And that's not an accident. Some people think that's partly about the Americans trying to deflect all the scandal onto this side of the Atlantic. But Ghislaine Maxwell, if people were watching that clip just a moment ago and listening to how she speaks, was very much a central figure within the British establishment, not least because of who her father was. And as Richard said earlier on, she was the Sloane Ranger par excellence. There's a certain character type in British public life, and she was the Queen Bee. So it does kind of feel that for Brits and British politicians in particular, there's a lot more to come.
Yeah, and I think that's the real story. I think the threesome, the details of the threesome are ultimately secondary in all of this. I think actually the point of this story is exactly what you just said, which is that it is about elites, transnational elites, transatlantic elites, mixing together, and in this case, a future prime minister mixing with somebody who obviously held the kind of lifestyle that Jeffrey Epstein held, and the sort of the salacious details at the corners of that are kind of irrelevant when it's about threesomes and adults and so on. What is relevant is that ultimately this was either back then or became a highly sophisticated international sex trafficking and paedophile ring. And for a British Prime Minister to have cavorted with those kinds of people, to have slept with those kinds of people, to have mixed with those kinds of people, and to have come from, if the people we think are responsible to have come from the same schools as these people, tells us a great deal about the ways in which power circulates and those networks operate.
Yeah. I mean, you saw Jeremy Kyle sort of, wow, really? There's a threesome? But the more you learn about who this person is, Ghislaine Maxwell, where she comes from, the more you learn about her father. I mean, it's the most predictable thing in the world, isn't it? This is the least of it. And it's not a shocking revelation. I think it happens a lot more than they want us to even consider possible. I think we'll leave it there. We've got a few super chats. Let me read those out quickly. I did say, send them our way, so I should at least read them, shouldn't I? This from Ishtak with £4.99. All these Labour right people were falling over themselves to be quite aware of the most tenuous allegations against Corbynistas. So true. I was aware that Corbyn said Epstein rather than Epstein. God, what a world. 2019, it feels like an eternity ago, 7 years ago, if you said Epstein, you were being anti-Semitic. That was the takeaway moment, right, for David Baddiel, if I remember correctly. How far we've moved now. If you mispronounce somebody's name, you're an anti-Semite. I think we had one more super chat. It was for a solitary pound, but I'll read it because that's what we do. We're fair. Oh no, just £1. There's no message there from James Givens 734. Thank you, James. Of course, if you want to support our work here at Novara Media, you can do so by going to novara.media/support or novaramedia.com/support. You can just give us £1 a month for building a different kind of media, doing journalism in a different kind of way. Kieran, I've loved tonight's conversation.
As have I. Thank you for having me back, and see you next Tuesday.
And thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. On a lighter note, and I think this is important, we don't want to be too sad and depressed about things. On a lighter note, you've narrowly said I should keep my beard. I don't know. I don't think my wife necessarily agrees. We'll see. I want to do it before it goes completely white. We have had some great shows over the last week, the rest this week as well. This is all a huge news story. My colleagues have been superb in covering it. I'm so lucky and privileged to be working with them. Join them again tomorrow night at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.